The first thing that happened was that a sniper got one of them, and I watched him die, which was horrible.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
To meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I had 2 quarters at Iowa State College, and at the end of the second quarter, I got a little edgy with my buddies going in that that was the place for me. Since I was taking engineering, in their great thinking, the Army said, well, let's put him in the engineers. So I was transferred to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where I had my first basic training course. The Corps of Engineers had a unique training group. They were building ponton bridges and working with explosives to blow up bridges. And I learned how to manipulate a compass out in the field and directions and things that I had never done before. So it was very informative. It was probably a 13-week basic course where they had introduction to various small arms. Mainly the M1 Grand was a 30 caliber. I also was introduced to the BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, which was also 30 caliber, but it was more like a submachine gun. So we headed towards England, and then actually landed in Normandy. And we went over the edge of the ships with our all packing and guns and backpacks and everything on these rope ladders down to the Higgins boats. And then that took us to the shore. And we were in Cherbourg, that area, for several weeks while we were waiting for another group to go on up into Germany. And at that time we had opportunity to walk around on these grassy fields. Normandy is so beautiful. They had hedgerows that outlined different fields. And so for probably a week and a half, those fields were nice and green. However, it didn't take long marching on those fields back in the rainy conditions for them to be just mud. And so they ended up being about 6 inches of mud. And we were in pup tents, 3 to a pup tent. And that made it a little difficult to get in the tent and sleep. Had to take your boots off and everything. From there, we hiked about 12 miles and then got to a train station. And you've probably heard of the 40 and 8 trains where they would take 8 horses or 40 men. And of course they packed us into that and moved us up quite a ways. And then for some, to get closer to the front line, our first opportunity was to replace the 29th Division, give them a relief. And so we actually got into their foxholes, which was nice. We didn't have to, they were about 5 feet deep and 2 men to a foxhole. And we could actually see the Germans across the valley, and they could see us, but we didn't fire on them and they didn't fire on us. At that time, it was just a holding action. However, one night, I reached up on the bank of the foxhole and I found a little tin cup. And I noticed as I ran my hand over, somebody had scratched a message in there. Well, there was the Lord's Prayer was scratched into that little disc there. So maybe it's true that there are no atheists in the foxholes. It wasn't long before people replaced us, and we went on up, heading towards the Roar River, and particularly the town of Linnich. But getting there was the battle that we were engaged in. It was a bunch of skirmishes into the different towns we went to. And each one was a little bit different, but they had the same pattern. When we fought our way into the villages, we took positions usually in the lower floor, and where we could look out the basement windows. And that was at sight level. One time, I remember we heard a tank come rattling up that road that was just right across with us. And I asked the sergeant, head sergeant, if I couldn't take my, at that time was an M1, and put a grenade launcher on it and shoot the back of the tank, which is the most vulnerable spot, and it would wipe the tank out. And he thought about it and said, well, let's not do that because they don't know we're here, and that'll give up our position. So we went on and secured that town, went on to another one, and again, on the way, it was such a shocking experience to see dead soldiers of Germans as well as the American soldiers along the side. And it was in December or November, and it was so cold that their bodies were frozen, and so it was a horrible picture, but a wake-up. One time we were assigned to a tank division, and all of a sudden we saw across the ridge the German tanks firing at us, and they were firing over us, and I thought, well, that's odd. So I looked around behind us, and we had a row of our tanks that they were shooting at, and that was lucky that the Germans were good shots because they didn't hit us. So that's one thing I can remember. The other thing was traveling, of course, on foot from area to area, an open area of tree-lined roads. And they had the habit of shooting their 88 millimeter cannons into the top of the trees so that the trees would burst and the limbs would go down on the soldiers on the road. Fortunately, we got through that all right. When we replaced and moved Germans out of a situation where they had foxholes, we jumped into their foxholes and then they knew where we were. In fact, the fella in the foxhole next to me took his helmet off and put it on his gun and raised the gun up, and immediately a shell came right through that helmet. So we were aware that they knew where we were and they had us covered. One other fellow, Jim Welch, I don't know why he did it. He knew what was happening, but he stood up and they picked him off just immediately. So I had a grenade launcher and fired the grenade launcher in the direction where I thought the snipers were. And fortunately, it stopped. Then we moved from there. I had the BAR, and my team, the two fellas that were my armor bearers, were actually twins. We had a plan where I'd be up front. They would be about 40 feet on either side and in kind of a triangle. The first thing that happened was that a sniper got one of them, and I watched him die, which was horrible. I could see his feet moving, and all of a sudden they stopped. And then his brother asked the aide if he was actually gone, and he said he was. And the brother then got a blast from a mortar that hit him, and he got some shrapnel there. And while he was getting up, the sniper shot him, and the bullet hit his helmet and actually went up through his helmet and out the other side. So he saved that helmet. So that was a time when my BAR jammed, and I picked up a German burp gun and sprayed what I thought was the area that the snipers might be in. And so from then we moved on forward, and I could see in a distance that the Germans were pulling back. And so they were quite a ways away, but I was able to fire at one, and he dropped. The thing that bothered us a lot on the line was the cold temperature. One of the coldest November, Decembers in Germany that they had had. And unfortunately, we didn't have proper socks. And we were standing in sloppy water and frozen ground. And they did want to have an examination of the troops, because they knew some of them were getting trench foot, that frozen feet or immersion foot. And so I went back, and I thought, well, they'll look it over and then they send me back. But I was among several that had pretty bad trench foot. So they put me in the hospital there in Liège, Belgium, a good-sized hospital. And it was only about 50 miles or less from there to Bastogne, where the Battle of the Bulge occurred, or started, back in the middle of December 1944. We could hear the buzz bombs as they were coming over, so we knew something was going on. They were trying to soften up that area. And what happened is they flew all of the people from that hospital to the London area. Many in the hospital had black feet, some of them skin peeling off, and many had to be amputated at the ankle. So I thank God that I was protected from that. Then came back to United States on the Queen Mary, which had been turned into a hospital ship. So we were actually taken onto the ship on litters, and the litters were piled up like 4 in a row to make a place to sleep while we were on the water. Then we hit the train, and they took us to a convalescent hospital in Colorado Springs, and actually ran into the other twin that hadn't been killed but was in a hospital. He was convalescing there also. And while we were there, they were having a service for his brother Jack, his name was Jim, in St. Louis. So I went back with him from Colorado Springs and was able to attend that memorial service. But as far as the hearing about the war being over, I was jubilant. And I knew that the war in the Pacific was not over yet, but that came later. But just to know that the buddies that I had that were still alive were safe made a big difference to me.